Depression is a combination of genetic, biological, psychological, sociological comorbidities that all come together that cause someone to feel sad, lack of interest, potentially suicidal, decreased activity, sleep disturbance, concentration issues, and these all lead to what we call a major depressive disorder. My name is Dr. Domenick Sportelli. I'm a medical doctor and board certified in child and adolescent psychiatry and adult psychiatry. When we talk about major depressive disorder, we talk about quite a bit with regard to why this happens to try and understand why people would go through depression. So we tend to break things down into the biological, the psychological, and the sociological aspects of this. From a biological perspective, some of the reasons why people would be depressed is actually an inherited quality. And believe it or not, people that experience a major depressive episode in their life, 40 to 50% of their first degree relatives may have also experienced a major depressive disorder. And what we notice biologically as well is that if that major depressive disorder occurred early in life for your first generation relative, meaning a parent or a sibling, then you're more likely to experience a major depressive episode in your life as well. So we do know that there's a biological component. And from that biology, we say, well, wow, what's going on here? Well, we think we understand that it has to do with neurotransmitters in the brain. And basically these neurotransmitters called monoamines. And I won't get into too much detail about that, but we definitely know that there's a biological mechanism for a depressive episode. The other aspects of depression that are very, very important are the psychological aspects of depression. And these are our own coping styles. How did we grow up? What did we experience in our lives psychologically? How did we respond to those psychological cues? Maybe we experienced trauma. Maybe we experienced neglect. Maybe we experienced adverse childhood experiences that could down the line lead to a mood disorder. Another piece of this is sociologically. What does our social life look like? Are we isolated? Do we have peers? Are we in a low socioeconomic circumstance, which could lead to mood disorders and depression? So we look at things in a very well-rounded way when we're trying to figure out what causes depression in each unique individual. Now, if you're asking yourself, do I have a major depressive disorder? Am I experiencing depression? Well, here are the criteria. First and most importantly is you have to experience a sad and depressed mood. And this is something that you've been experiencing for over 2 weeks or more. So it's not something that's just fleeting one day here and one day there. It's something for at least 2 weeks that you've been experiencing a sad and depressed mood. Now, associated with that are loss of interest in things that you used to like. And the fancy word for that is anhedonia. That means I used to love playing golf and now I really don't care about it whatsoever. That's lack of interest in something. Feelings of guilt. People feel inherent guilt when they're depressed. People feel decreased energy when they're depressed. We can also decrease concentration and attention. Our eating habits can change pretty significantly, and that can go both ways. Sometimes people eat more and they gain weight. Sometimes people eat less and they lose weight. But the important thing is that there's a change based on your mood. What we also see in depression is psychomotor retardation. And what that means is people tend to move a little bit slower, talk a little bit slower, even walk a little bit slower when they're feeling down and depressed. And then of course, we cannot not address feelings of suicidality and worthlessness and hopelessness. So when people have at least 5 of those symptoms for 2 weeks at a time, and it's not related to a medical problem or another psychiatric issue, we really think about classifying that as a major depressive disorder. And if that's the case, we have various ways to treat it, including psychotherapy, which absolutely works. We have medicines as well that we know are verified empirically that can help pretty tremendously, and other aspects that can really, really help with a major depressive disorder. Suicide is a very real thing and a very dangerous thing, obviously, and we deal with this all the time in the field of behavioral health. And people often ask, why would somebody ever want to harm themselves? And there are lots of reasons for this, and every circumstance is unique. Understanding this a little bit better might help us approach these individuals in a better way and even treat them better. So why would somebody even think about harming themselves? Well, first and foremost, it might be escape from a discomfort or a circumstance or a situation. Another reason might be that they're trying to escape feelings. They're very, very depressed or very, very anxious. So in most cases, it's an escape. In a lot of cases, suicide feels to the individual that it's the only solution that they can come to get rid of these uncomfortable emotions and circumstances in their lives. Another reason why somebody might consider hurting themselves is physical pain. Sometimes we see people that have significant chronic pain in their lives and they can't control it, and it leads them to think down the lines of self-injury or suicide. So another thing to address as well is, what is it about the potential increase in suicide lately? And we've identified some things in research. One is that there still is a mental health stigma. So people do still unfortunately perceive mental illness, whether it's depression or anxiety or something like bipolar disorder, they still think, wow, there's something wrong with me that's a character flaw. I shouldn't be experiencing this. No one will understand this. I can't talk to anybody about this. So there's still that stigma, and what that does, it sets up an environment where they don't feel understood, they feel isolated, they feel alone, and they feel as though they cannot get help. So that's one reason why we think that suicide rates are as prevalent as they are. A couple of other thoughts are, individuals that have access to lethal means can absolutely increase the suicide rate. Economic circumstances, when we go through economic turmoil, this can absolutely bump the suicide rate. We've recently gone through a pandemic with a lot of isolation, which contributed to a lot of mood disorders, so we know that for sure. Social isolation, as I just said, with the pandemic was a big one. Substance use is on the rise. We know that the opioid epidemic is an incredibly dangerous circumstance, at least in the United States right now, and that will also drive up the potential for self-harm, self-injury, and suicide. When children experience something called adverse childhood experiences like trauma, neglect, abuse, they have a higher likelihood of hurting themselves as well. So in the case of society and socioeconomics, if kids are having a hard time, well, then that generation might have a hard time down the line as well. So we look at what's called adverse childhood experiences. Media influence is a big one. Now, media is everywhere, and we have access to so much information now, and there is something called suicide contagion, where if people or kids or adolescents, or even adults for that matter, see people harming themselves, maybe even see people that they looked up to, such as role models, mentors, or famous individuals that engaged in self-injury, there could potentially be what we call a suicide contagion. So we want to pay attention to that as well. And unfortunately, with the rise of social media, there is a rise in what we call cyberbullying. And this is especially challenging because it's really hard for children and adolescents and even adults to escape bullying and criticism and harassment. So it makes it very, very hard. And unfortunately, a lot of these individuals think that the only escape is to harm themselves and engage in suicidal behavior. So when we're thinking about this, and I deal with this in the emergency departments quite often, unfortunately, if you feel that someone might be feeling depressed or sad or suicidal, there are a couple things that you can do to help them. And I think most importantly, let them know that you care and that they're not alone. Because I'm telling you right now, probably a large reason why they feel the way they feel is because they feel isolated and misunderstood. So that will go a long way. When you do this, you want to do it in a non-judgmental way, in a non-critical way. Reassure the individual that what they're going through is not permanent. In psychiatry, we have an old cliche saying, and it says that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And when you're in the midst of a storm, sometimes it's really, really hard to see your way out. So you need someone else who can see past that storm to guide you through that storm and get you to the sunlight on the other side. And that's a really, really important thing to think about when you're helping somebody that's going through something like this. What I find is, and people are afraid to do this, and research has proven otherwise, and I think this is a very important point. People fear that if I talk about suicide with my kids or with someone that might be feeling suicidal or depressed, that is going to contribute to their suicidal behavior. Well, that has been proven wrong. So actually, awareness and discussing suicidal thoughts and feelings with someone that you think might be experiencing these things has more of a likelihood to help them than to hurt them. So you're very unlikely going to do more harm by talking to somebody about this. Now, I understand that a lot of you out there are not behavioral health professionals, but what I will tell you are some things that don't help. And it's very common for us in the non-medical community or non-behavioral health community to think that we could just say, hey, cheer up, you'll be fine. People that are going through a major depressive episode, that will make them feel more misunderstood and more isolated. So things that you want to avoid is saying things like, hey, cheer up, you'll be fine. Being dismissive of it can be a little challenging for somebody. Just changing the subject and not really engaging it can be hard for the individual that's suffering with this. Even sometimes just trying to give advice the way you would handle it sometimes isn't the best way to do it. Asking them directly, are you feeling suicidal? Don't be afraid to ask someone directly. Are you feeling like you want to end your life? Do you have suicidal thoughts? Are you feeling suicidal? Do you have a plan to hurt yourself? We know in research that by asking these direct questions, you're more likely to engage in a productive conversation that can get this individual help. Some do's and don'ts, some understanding of suicidality and why it's been happening and why it takes place, and how to approach it. But I'm going to say this as a medical doc, as a behavioral health specialist, the way that I look at suicide intention or suicidal thinking, that is the heart attack if I was a cardiologist, meaning that's an emergency. So if somebody that you love or care about or know is experiencing suicidal thinking, it's an emergency. It's time to call 911, it's time to intervene, and it's time to get them help. So hopefully this makes a little bit more sense about such an incredibly challenging topic. As a parent, what you always look for is change. And I know that sounds so basic, but we know our kids. So pay attention to any change that you notice in their behavior, and that could be anything. But when it comes to a mood disorder, I'm going to give you some specifics. One is noticing persistent sadness or irritability. Now, what we tend to notice in the behavioral health community as doctors and clinicians is that children tend to exhibit depression as more irritability and anger and potentially acting out with behavioral problems, as opposed to an adult that can verbalize what they're feeling and say, yeah, I'm just really sad, I'm really down. Or maybe I can say that. It's harder for a child to understand their emotions, so they tend to act out their feelings in a way that exhibits as irritable behavior and acting out type behavior. So pay attention to any behavioral changes. Another very important thing to think about, or a few more things to think about that are very important, are changes in sleep patterns. Always pay attention to sleep patterns because sometimes they're the first clue when a mental health crisis is coming, especially in the affective disorders, the mood disorders like anxiety and depression and bipolar. So pay attention to your child's sleep habits. Are they sleeping more? Are they sleeping less? Is there any change? And just tick that off on a box to pay attention to. What about changes in appetite or weight? You might notice that your child is eating more or eating less. Maybe they're gaining weight or losing weight. Maybe they're losing interest in food. Now, these are those basics in life, sleep and appetite, that do change and they follow the pattern of mood disorders. So pay attention to that, something easy to pay attention to. Do you notice that your child has less energy? Do you notice that they have less concentration? These are signs as well. And then, of course, when it comes to mood disorders, are they acting or verbalizing anything about worthlessness or guilt? Anything along those lines of hopelessness or helplessness?
I am sick of suffering in silence. Today, I will stomp and scream and shout until every word inside of me is out.
And then what we've talked about before with mental health in children is a lot of children will manifest their behavioral health issues as somatic complaints, as physical complaints. So pay attention if suddenly your child is saying, oh, I have a stomach ache, I have a headache, I'm nauseous all the time. These can absolutely be medical problems and should be looked into. But sometimes emotional disturbances will manifest in children as somatic disturbances, meaning bodily sensations. So pay attention to that as well. And then, of course, anything with regard to suicidality or self-injury.
Show me.
What?
Show me.
Mom?
You burn yourself?
Mom.
Really, really important to acknowledge and address. Now, you're paying attention to these things as a parent, but I always say keep an open line of communication with your kids from the beginning and let them know that it's okay to speak to you about anything without fear of criticism and judgment. And this way you can have an open conversation and you can get the help that you need.